So I'm pretty decent at lucid dreaming myself. I've been practicing it since I turned like 12 or something. So I can recognize that I'm in a dream state and I can control it and hold it. I can't, like, I'm not one of those people who can do like spider webs or flying, although I've tried it a few times. But one of the craziest things that I experienced with lucid dreaming is that time runs so much faster. So I actually practiced essentially setting my own alarm such that when I'm in a lucid dream, I can say, hey, it's time for me to get out of it. Wake up. And it's like right on time when I need to go. And the beautiful thing is it actually works like various times. Like one day I need to wake up at 11 a.m., the next day I need to wake up at 6 a.m., and I can just tell myself in my dream that, hey, it's time to go. It's kind of weird because usually it like becomes part of my storyline that I create for myself, where I have an external signal. I wonder exactly why that works compared to, say, having wall time go along with the actual time. But I have things like external signals that I can set for myself in my own dream. They are not external to me, but they're external to my sort of person in the dream. Kind of gets confusing when you're talking about lucid dreaming because you have control both over yourself and your environment, not just over how you perceive the environment, which is kind of weird. I guess it is how you perceive the environment, but you can run simulations. So that's usually what I do when I'm lucid dreaming. And I think you get about 7x speed up. So I can run usually around, 5 or 6 simulations a night. And that allows me to do quite a bit of interesting work. Sometimes I do like homework. Sometimes I do working on various different research projects, building algorithms. The hardest part with lucid dreaming for me is holding whatever I was dreaming once I wake up and being able to then sort of convert that, like put it on paper or, execute it or things like that. Especially when I'm working on composing music, I will forget it. But the thing I've practiced quite a bit, and the thing that's actually quite difficult, is jumping back into a dream, especially the next day. So my favorite technique for lucid dreaming is essentially the repeated check. So what I did in order to learn it was I used the technique of every time I got up, every time I stand up, every time I sit down, every time I touch my side, I trained myself to stop and say, am I awake? Am I awake? What am I thinking? What's going on? Practice this while I was awake, answering yes. Eventually, actually, in order for me to do it successfully, I had to practice when I'm fully awake, it's yes. When I'm sort of awake, it's sort of. And then when I was asleep, I started recognizing it, and I was like, I'm asleep. So every time I do it, I'm like, I'm asleep. Great. Now what? And that's where it gets hard. Like recognizing that you're in the dream is one thing. Being able to change it is the next easiest thing because you're like, okay, I'm in this dream. Let's run this scenario. The thing that's really hard, especially for me, is staying in it. So it's like, when you have one of those vivid dreams and you're like having the best time of your life, and then you like wake up and you're like, why? Well, try that when you know you're dreaming and know that you're having a good time and are in control of it. And then you wake up and are like, come on, I was trying here. So I honestly still haven't figured out how to get around that flaw, but I've gotten pretty good at getting back into the dream, especially if it's like just woke up and now going back to sleep. But also it's like I can do it when I'm doing what's it called? Like if I'm staying awake for a little bit, I can actually do it because I've spent enough time practicing explicitly waking myself up, waiting a certain amount of time, and trying to get back into the dream. Actually, that whole trying to get into a dream quickly and on command was the key in order to learn lucid dreaming for me, was to learn how to fall asleep. I was on a tour on a bus, and we had only a certain amount of time that we were able to sleep because other times we were doing things, we were doing work. So I had to train myself like, hey, now I want to fall asleep. I have to go now. I have to fall asleep and then I have to wake up. And learning to fall asleep, the last thing you remember is I'm going to go to sleep. And so the next thing you know, assuming you didn't wake up, because usually once you're in a dream, you jump off at a random point. You don't usually like dream that you woke up from exactly where you went to sleep. You're like, okay, last thing I remember is I'm going to sleep. Now I'm not in that state, I'm in a dream. The snapping is a very interesting phenomenon, actually. It's a trick I use. So if you notice that, you might want to try it. You apply any kind of physical motion, you can tie it to a thought. And tying it to a thought allows you to tie it to an interrupt and a behavior. Think of it like kind of a CPU interrupt is kind of like I like to think about it. When you have a certain external stimulus, it goes and it triggers this interrupt vector. It takes your execution and stops it for a second, puts it aside, and says, okay, now do these steps and then get back to it. And when you do those steps, when you hit that interrupt, you're able to actually change what you're thinking, change what you're seeing. Been working really hard on doing this while fully awake. And so I can sometimes, on my own, place things in the world visually, sort of like a controlled visual hallucination, although I'm still not good at it. But in my dreams, I'm able to do it pretty reliably say, hey, this is a dream state. I went to sleep. I chose this state. Now here's the scenario I want to run. And the beautiful thing is then you can just say, okay, reset, when you get to a point that you don't like. That's probably actually the most fun thing about lucid dreaming to me is the ability to say, reset, I want to try a different scenario. So I was pretty much self-taught when I learned to lucid dream. I know that there are various different techniques, various different people who try to teach it, and I don't think that it's all that useful. I think it's really a matter of practice makes perfect, and there's no such thing as perfect in this context, but there is such thing as you get to the point where you can reliably get yourself into a dream, keep it, pull out of it, and return to it. And once you can do that, then you have control. So another part, though, that a lot of people, like I said before, people think lucid dreaming, oh, I can fly, I can be Spider-Man. Well, that depends on your ability to imagine. At the end of the day, when you're in a dream, you're playing a scenario. You have to be able to understand that scenario, at least to the extent that you're able to experience it. I've always wanted to say, lucid dream and experience being a bat. I know, you know the famous paper, What's It Like to Be a Bat? But I can't, right? Because my brain doesn't have the ability to do that. And my imagination when it comes to imagining sort of impossible things is not great. So I can't really imagine myself being Spider-Man. I can't shoot webs because I just don't have that ability to visualize that, to feel that. But I can, say, imagine myself driving, getting into a hurricane, car accident, awkward interaction with someone I had met a long time ago. All of those things that you can imagine, you can place in as scenarios in your dream. Interestingly, it's very hard to control what other people in your dream do, because there's sort of an autopilot taking place here. Whereas you can control a lot about the environment, but your brain automatically fills in what you're getting from the people who you're interacting with in your dream. You can't straight up control them. And why is kind of an interesting question. My theory is because it's based on your ability to predict. At any given moment, you're constantly predicting the immediate future. If you weren't, you would not be able to process everything that you're experiencing. There's more sensory information than we can process. It requires too long to process. So we cannot have a real-time understanding of the world based on our senses. Where does our real-time understanding come from? Our ability to predict. So that same ability to predict for a short period of time that we use always in order to stay current, right, stay real-time, understand the now, can be played out indefinitely, although it does hit some weird loops sometimes. And that's how we're able to have interactions that our brain just completely simulates. Because when we're in the middle of a conversation, when we're in the middle of doing something, our brain's already simulating the next answer. It's like speculative execution almost, where you're like, hey, here's the most likely next answers. I'm going to simulate all of them. And then once I get something that indicates that these are not them, it's going to collapse, and then I'm going to continue simulating just based on these possibilities. And that way you're always able to respond quickly and sort of be in the moment, even though your senses are behind the moment and your brain is ahead of it. So how then do you change it? Well, how you change it is by controlling your perception. You have to choose, instead of what you want to happen, what you want not to. You have to collapse a certain possibility. I can't really describe how to do this very effectively, but one trick that works sometimes is you say, hey, that's not what happened, actually this happened, to something in the past, and then continue. You essentially convince yourself that you remembered it wrong. And once you think you remembered something wrong, once you think that your perception is wrong, your perception is going to go to the next thing, and the prediction runs forward, onwards and onwards. Now, of course, your senses are slow, your prediction is fast. That's how we're able to keep going. And that's part of why you're able to dream at a much faster rate than you can while you're awake, because you're not waiting for that sensory feedback. You're not waiting for that body motion. You're just going straight on the prediction. You're at the speed of your prediction. And since in real life, you have to predict like a dozen different scenarios in order to stay current because of the rate that you get which scenario that I'm currently in your dream, you only have to predict one, and you'll pick whichever one you went first. And so you have that natural, 7x speed up from the fact that you're not making 7 predictions. Which actually raises an interesting question of whether things are happening serially or in parallel. We perceive them. Well, we actually typically only perceive one at a time, but if you practice, if you really train yourself, you can perceive them in parallel, all of the predicted realities. But the fact that you would dream faster would almost indicate that they're actually getting processed in series rather than in parallel. And I'm not entirely sure how to rectify this. One answer could be that it is an inconsistent dream, if you will, where you're taking 7 different possibilities or 8 different possibilities or 2, whatever, and you're saying, hey, these are for this moment, and then I'm going to skip the next moment altogether and just do another one. Again, no evidence of this. And then the other option is that the way that we actually cue things in our brain is occurring essentially where we take all of the predictions, and in order to cue them, we have to put them in sequence. Or vice versa. We do them in sequence, and then we line them up in parallel for you to analyze. I really don't know which one the answer is. I'd love to find a good way of knowing. Always wanted to actually be able to record my dreams. Unfortunately, we don't really have a good enough technique. EEG is just way too imprecise. fMRI, although we've seen some success with reconstruction of mental imagery, it's like very limited. And it's of course loud, it disturbs sleep. The current machines are just nowhere near as precise as we would need. I don't think that something like Musk's Neuralink will actually solve this problem, because it doesn't have the ability to record in the amount of detail that we need. Although, I think that if we attach recording points whether that be through physical attachments or through, just measuring EM or something like that. We might be able to do it if we attach these recording points to our motor neurons and our sensory inputs, because essentially all we have to reproduce in order to get back into the concept is whatever triggered it. If we can set up the initial conditions, then we can just allow ourselves to play it out. And maybe we'll have a different way of recording it. Not entirely sure if that'll ever work out, but I do know how we could test it. It's not a way that I think anyone would sign up for, but we could. My God, that's gross to think about, but we could cut people's eyeballs out and attach things to their optic nerve, right? I don't entirely know what'll come with that, but I think also using AI and various different neural networks as models in order to say, replicate, hey, we have this artificial intelligence and we have this natural intelligence. How do I set up the inputs and the initial conditions such that they have the same result? Then how can I introspect on one in order to make a prediction about how the other one is operating? So if we were able to reproduce some form of mental internal state within a neural network model or any other kind of AI system, we might be able to extrapolate into dream states. So we might be able to say, hey, can we predict the next behavior? Can we predict the next internal state? And then can we examine this internal state and match it up with an internal state of a human? Then all we have to do is set up the correct initial conditions, and we might be able to get a recording without ever even taking the measurements. But that's, again, very speculative. I'm not sure if that'll actually play out. Let's see. Another concept, keeping going off of that lucid dreaming, is putting two things in parallel. The ability to perceive in parallel is a very strange phenomenon. We can, with, say, music, recognize chunks, recognize parallel notes, parallel phrases as a single item, and thereby have two different processes going on, one recognizing, say, the piano part, and the other recognizing, say, the accordion or the drums or whatever. And we don't have the ability to say, process this one first and what is it doing, and then process that one, what is it doing. We sort of take in the stream in parallel, and anything that has to be sequenced is all behind the scenes. That means that we have separate loops. We're able to actually separate our thought into multiple different streams of information to be processed. We don't actually think sequentially, even though our consciousness might be sequential. Now, it's interesting that there's a relationship with transformer models, which we always think of as sequence models. And we think of them as, okay, well, it's taking the series and it's predicting what the next token is. Well, there isn't actually an inherent order. We assign all of the tokens that go into a transformer model with a position encoding mechanism. But that mechanism doesn't have to encode position. An architecture that for some reason is just not explored is one where you have two different position encoding mechanisms. So let's say you had two different sources of information, two different data streams that are both variable length. Currently, what you would do is you would put one in first and then put the second one in, and then you would just have some kind of intermediate token in between them to say, like, hey, now this is the start of the second thing. But that means you can't really optimize for that at training time, and it means that you can't do both generations at the same time. Because, again, you're just not built for having two different lengths. You're not built for having the beginning of A in a different position than the beginning of B, and you're certainly not in a position to have it in a different position every single step. But there's no reason we can't have two different position embedding mechanisms so that we would have sequence A and sequence B, and they would both be read sort of in parallel, and we can generate the next token of both at the same time. Right? There's no reason we can't. And there's no reason we can't standardize that start token to be a specific value. And then if we have forward masking on our attention, obviously it'd be cross attention, and you would just forward mask anything in front on both sequences, rather than having sequence 2 able to attend to all of sequence 1, but not the other way around. Just a thought out there that we need to be exploring that type of architecture. I'm finding it very difficult to articulate a specific use case, and I think that might be a large a part of why people haven't actually adopted such a technique. Because almost all use cases that we can really think of, we're only trying to generate one thing. But one use case that I'm looking at is, what if we're trying to generate two different modalities at the same time? It's more of an obvious thing when we're looking at input, where we're like, hey, I want to take in a set of images and a set of words, and I really want them to be separate, right? Because I've got a certain amount of sort of images that varies every time, and I've got a certain amount of words that varies every time. But I'd only really be generating output words. Now, if I had a certain set of English text and a certain set of Spanish text, and I'm trying to generate something coherent in both languages, where there is no inherent sequence, and yet there is still a relationship between the two, then I might be able to make use of the ability to have these parallel streams. Or alternatively, if I want to have one stream to be the thought chain and another stream to be the output chain, where I want to be able to sort of think and output at the same time, that might be a good use of parallel streams. But yeah, for some reason, it's just not an explored architecture. Anyways, getting that back a little bit to lucid dreaming, there's a technique that I've been working on, which is parallelizing multiple dreams, parallelizing multiple experiences of reality. And it's an interesting phenomenon. You gotta feel it to believe it, if you will. But you can sort of have two different things going on at the same time, and your conscious mind almost has that sort of, that effect where if you have, I forgot what it's called, but if you have like two different sounds, one in one ear and one in the other, and it sort of alternates between the two, but yet somehow you can still have a coherent process through both. And it's an interesting time-saving technique. It's kind of hard to get used to, kind of hard to even do in the first place. But yeah, I would love to figure out what other people are doing with similar techniques of trying to have parallel streams. But the biggest goal with that parallel stream is being able to do it while awake. I think that ultimately, lucid dreaming is about how can we control our own mind, and we use sleep as the time that we have that we can extend by controlling ourselves. But if we could parallelize and extend our time while awake, we have so much more potential.